zoos. Somebody want to give me a quick definition as to what they would expect for this house would ban public zoos?
For one thing, the protection of the extinct animals.
That's an argument. Somebody want to give me a definition for this house would ban public zoos? Good argument though. How would you just stand up if I told you right now 1 minute speech on this house would ban public zoos? How would you define that? And everyone in this lecture is capable of doing that, so it should be very easy. Yeah.
That the government should ban children from attending zoos, or the government would ban the involuntary confinement of animals within the confines of a building called a zoo.
Yeah, I like the second one. I'm not so sure about the first. Okay, but it's interesting that you had the first. I like the fact that you had the first. It makes my point easier. All right, that is the natural definition of this house would ban public zoos, right? That the government would pass a law to say you're not allowed to keep animals in cages or in enclosures artificially for profit or for people to come in and see them, right? All right, so the definition that Shamila got was this house would ban public zoos, and the meaning that the other team gave of public was public ownership, as in government ownership of zoos. So this house would ban government ownership of zoos. All right, do people think that this is fair? No? Okay, tell me why if you think it's unfair. Look at these two things. Tell me if there's anything wrong within that. Yeah. See, my biggest thing is that I don't actually think it's unfair, unlike Shamila's absolute hatred of what the other team did. It's actually not very unfair. It certainly probably isn't within the spirit of the motion, but it's probably not an unreasonable definition. My biggest problem with that kind of definition is that there's not a whole lot to talk about when you're setting up the whole distinction between the debate for 6 speeches about whether the government should own zoos or whether private companies should own zoos. It gets really tiresome for the adjudicators to try and, at the end of the debate, create clash in their own heads as to what the issue is. And that's kind of my biggest problem with that. Although some people would say it's a little bit unfair in terms of it's quite unexpected for the opposition team. But if you got that, would anybody here run a definitional challenge? No. Okay, let's move on to the next slide then. Because then you can tell me why you wouldn't run a definition. Alright, so on what basis you can actually run a definitional challenge? If it's a time set or a place set, if it's truistic or tautological, or if it's an unreasonable squirrel. There's no such thing as a reasonable squirrel, so I don't know why I put that up there. Okay, alright, so the first one, time set, place set. This house would ban public zoos in Abkhazia. That would be a place set, okay? You're setting it in a place for no identifiable reason, and you're saying we're going to talk about Abkhazia because I want to show you my specialist knowledge in it. I don't have any specialist knowledge in Abkhazia anyway. That's an unreasonable place set. We're going to talk about reasonable place sets in a minute. Alright? Time set. This is something that's done in Canadian debating a lot, and sometimes inadvertently people do this. Something absolutely crazy. Alright, actually something that's not so crazy. This house believes preemptive strikes are never justified. Alright? This house believes preemptive strikes are never justified. Does everyone understand what preemptive strikes are?
Yes.
Does anyone not understand what preemptive strikes are? Okay. Preemptive strikes are when a country will attack another country before they themselves are attacked. Okay? So, if I was to give you guys that particular motion, is there an issue that would jump out at you guys? Sorry? Iraq, did somebody say? Yeah, Iraq's great. Alright. Would it be fair to say this house believes preemptive strikes are never justified? We're going to look at whether or not the war on Iraq was justified. You're nodding yes? It would be fair? Does anybody agree or disagree with that?
I disagree.
You disagree? Okay, does anybody else agree or disagree with that? Everyone should have an opinion on this. It's important. So, the proposition team gets up and says, this house believes preemptive strikes are never justified. We're going to talk about this in terms of Iraq.
It's pretty fair.
It's pretty fair? Yeah, okay. Is it a time set? The strikes against Iraq have already happened. In fact, they've happened several years ago. Is it a time set to say that we're going to talk about Iraq only? Okay, I think it is. I think if you're just narrowing it down to a particular example that happened a decade ago and saying that that's the only place or the only strike that you're going to discuss is close to a time set. Time sets happen more frequently than you think, but it's whether or not they can be justified in a particular way. Now, some people will think that that's absolutely fair to talk about Iraq. I think that Iraq is just an example of a preemptive strike. I do not think that you should be narrowing the whole debate down to something that happened 6 years ago. If it was a current strike, for example, this house believes preemptive strikes are never justified. Let's talk about Israel, right? Preemptive strike on Gaza, apparently to demolish the huge attacks of their 6 rockets that they sent out. All right, that motion. Would that be fair? Yeah, because it's now. It's happening now. You can actually have a debate about it. Trying to have a debate about Iraq is a little bit weird when it's already happened. What you can do is use Iraq as an example after you've defined the motion to prove what you've actually set out to prove. But you probably shouldn't set it to just evaluating something that's happened a long time ago for your motion, because it doesn't lend to a particularly good debate. Use them as examples. All right. Truistic, tautological. Do people understand what those words mean? Yes? Does anyone not understand what those words mean?
I understand truistic, but I don't understand
Tautological. Okay, tautological is actually hardest to explain. Just quickly, truistic is when something is so obviously true that you really can't create negative arguments on it. Alright? This house would not eat meat. Alright? That's the motion. The proposition turns up and goes, we believe that meat are human beings. We believe that human beings, it's wrong to kill them. Therefore, this house would not murder human beings. Okay? Right? So, we are probably some kind of whatever, but if they defined it in a way which made you argue against murder, that would be truistic. Okay? Like, it is so obviously true that the opposition team doesn't get left with a lot of arguments. Alright, tautology. Alright, a tautology is a circular argument. Alright? The grass is green, therefore the green is grass. That kind of thing. Like, it just goes around in a circle. And some of the ways that it can be defined tautologically is when you're defining words like best or most effective or something like that. Like, if you define best system of representative governance and you define best as representative governance, and then you're saying the best system of representative governance is representative governance, that's a tautology. You're running it around in a circle because the words that are meant to imply something in a motion, you're just defining as each other. And it's really a really bad way to set up a debate. you need to be really careful that you never define keywords like best in a debate ever like that. Okay, you need a different set of criteria for how you would evaluate best. Or a word like best, obviously. Alright, and a wholly unreasonable squirrel. You know that lovely example that I just gave you about meat being people, therefore we should not kill people? That would be a wholly unreasonable squirrel. Okay? So a squirrel, that is a debate terminology. A squirrel means that you're basically squirreling away from the issue that is set. You have been given a particular motion that most people would think should be defined in a particular way, and you have taken it and decided to do a fancy interpretation of it, which doesn't actually debate the motion at hand at all. Alright? So the meat one is obvious. Most people who would look at that topic would say that was talking about whether or not we should be vegetarians or whether or not we should be meat eaters. To try and then say meat is defined as humans is a squirrel. Another squirrel would be something like this house would legalise performance-enhancing drugs in sport, right? If you define sport as everyday life, because we're all having fun and having an activity, and we think that sport is life, because it's a lot of joy, and you define legalised performance-enhancing drugs as marijuana, because marijuana enhances your performance in terms of your ability to be calm and not be stressed during your life. Okay? And so the motion ends up being this house should legalise marijuana. Right. That is a squirrel, and that is a very obvious squirrel.
When I first started debate, I had the motion this house would bomb Iranian nuclear plants.
Mm-hmm.
And our team made the huge mistake of defining bomb as peacefully eradicate with negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of became a legend in the high school tournament.
That is a squirrel of a squirrel of a squirrel, right? There is no way that when you have the word bombing, that you're allowed to interpret it as negotiation. There is no way that you have, when you have the word attack, that you're allowed to define it as peaceful negotiation. One of the most interesting squirrels that I heard most recently in the World's Tournament is that this house would assassinate Putin. Now, that is a terrible motion on many levels, right? But one of the most terrible ways that I heard of interpreting it was this house would commit a character assassination on him. Tell him he's bad, right? Okay? And that was defined by many, many people. Has a link to the topic. If you define each individual word within this house would assassinate Putin, it fits. But really, does it actually set up an issue? Does it set up an issue that we think can last 6 speeches? Is it actually a squirrel? Yes, it is. There is no way that the motion setters thought that assassinating Putin meant that we would just write lots about him and say in public media that he's a bad guy, right? Which is what this team ran, that we would want to character assassinate them because they were too chicken to run the actual motion. It's not that they didn't understand it, and that I have a problem with. When you're too afraid to run the motion that has been set in front of you. The worst thing is people think that oh my gosh, this is a big motion. How am I going to define it? This is quite hard, so I'm just going to narrow it to something that's quite unreasonable, and I can win that. This is the problem with doing that. If any of the adjudicators have set this motion, or if any of the other adjudicators like it or whatever, and they're coming into it thinking that they're going to see something about a particular issue, they will hate you for not running that issue. It will be so much harder for you to win, which is the best reason to never do it, because they will take it out on you. Trust me, I've done it. So, be really careful about doing that, because you will annoy adjudicators and they will take it into account when they're marking you, even if you think it's the easier case to run, right? Okay, so that's that. Right, how do I run a definitional challenge? The first thing to say is that you shouldn't run a definitional challenge, but if you need to. Alright, why shouldn't you run a definitional challenge? Most debates, we want about issues, real issues, arguments that flow back and forth. The one thing I don't want to know back and forth is different dictionary definitions of the same word, right? It's really boring, but moreover it creates a bad debate. In certain circumstances, you may need to run a definitional challenge, alright? And those circumstances are the ones that we talked about before. If it's truistic, if it's wholly unreasonable, if it's a huge squirrel, those kinds of categories are pretty much the only categories which you can run a definitional challenge. If you are going to do it, you need to say it at first speaker. You need to make it exceptionally clear that you're running a definitional challenge. You need to make the adjudicators very, very aware of it. Obviously, explain why, and then provide a new definition which you thought was more accurately representing the debate that what we debated. Alright? It's very difficult to run a definitional challenge well. Alright? That's why you want to stay away from it, because if the adjudicator agrees that the proposition team's definition was fair, it's very hard for the opposition team to win. Alright? So be really, really careful of that. However, a definitional challenge is something separate from challenging the parameters of the debate or challenging the criteria of the debate. Okay? So, this House believes that the war on Iraq was unjustified. Right? If they define unjustified as illegal, this House believes that it's unjustified because the war on Iraq was legal. It was not passed through UN resolutions. That's the only way that it would become justified, is if it had a legal backing towards it, and the only way we can get that is through running it through the UN General Assembly and then for it to not be voted down with the Security Council. Alright? That's actually not unfair, it's not really unreasonable, it's not any of those things. It's within the spirit of the motion, talking about wars being unjustified when they are illegal. But you as the opposition team, would you want to accept that? This House believes that the war in Iraq was unjustified. We're going to show you that it was unjustified because it was illegal. We think illegality makes a war unjustified. Here's the ways in which it was illegal, and here's why it was unjustified. As an opposition team, what would you want to say to that? Okay, so one of my criteria that I've set up for something being unjustified is whether it's illegal, right? Do you think I'm probably going to win that on the proposition? Sorry? It's a little bit truistic, but it's not unfair enough to probably want to call it truistic on the opposition side. What do you want to do in the opposition side? No, hang on. I'm going to get somebody else to answer this question because it's really important. You don't want to run a definitional challenge, right? But it's hard, perhaps, to prove that the war in Iraq was legal. A little bit hard. Not necessarily impossible by any stretch of the imagination if you want to have that debate. All power to you. But there's probably a better way to attack that case. What is it?
I would like to give another criteria as opposition, like human rights or something like that.
Perfect. Exactly. So you don't want to challenge the definition. You don't want to challenge their definition of Iraq. You don't want to challenge definition of war. You don't necessarily even want to challenge their definition of unjustified. What you do want to do is add to it, right? So you want to add, because their criteria for unjustified was whether something was legal or not, right? But there are other criteria with which to evaluate whether or not the war on Iraq was justified. And you as the negative team can come up with that criteria. And that's a far better way of saying it, rather than just going, you've run a truistic case, we're not going to engage with you, right? You can say, we're going to have that debate about illegality, but that's not the only way we can talk about whether something is unjustified or not. We're going to talk about unjustified as to whether or not we have actually managed to save a whole lot more lives than would otherwise be the case, right? We think a war is justified when it saves more lives than it hurts, right? That's one of the ways. Or when a country is in need of protection because its citizens are unable to protect itself. We think that's when a war is justified. Those kinds of things. We think a war is justified when they have actually attacked you first. If they've attacked you first. Those kinds of criteria you may want to put in there, and it will give you a lot more leeway to move within the debate. Alright, does everyone understand the distinction between challenging the definition and challenging the parameters or the criteria of the debate? Yeah, because it's crucial. It's something that all opposition teams need to be able to do. We're going to go into a little bit more detail later as well. We'll get you going to run through some cases, but we'll do that for now. Leave that for now. Alright, next question. Alright, when am I allowed to place set in a proposition case? I was trying to come up with rules last night at 4 a.m. And to be honest, it's on experience, which is the worst answer in the world. But I tried to come up with a couple of things that when you place set. You know how I said you can run a definitional challenge if you place set or if you time set? Well, I lied. In some instances, you are actually allowed to place set, which is one of the most confusing things in debating definitions. When are you allowed to actually limit the motion down to one specific area, one specific country, and when can't you? When will it be called unfair to do that, right? So it's something that does come with a lot of experience, but you may want to look at these, the couple of things that I've got up there. The first thing was, is there a reasonably clear link between the motion and the area you are setting the motion to, right? So can you justify your decision to narrow down the motion in a logical way? I don't mean make lots of arguments to say that something should be narrowed down. I mean that there's some obvious reason that has sprung out at you for why you would wish to narrow this debate down, okay? And the second thing is whether or not the opposition team are expected to know about this issue. Alright, and that's really important. When you're debating within South Korea, and all of the teams are South Korean, you can often limit the motion down to talk about within South Korea. In international competitions, it is less fair. In this particular competition, it also may be excessively unfair for you guys to always limit it down to South Korea when there are teams from, say, Japan within this competition. So it's not the nicest thing in the world to do, to immediately switch to we're going to talk about South Korea as this house, okay? I know it's the most comfortable thing to do, but there might not be a link between South Korea and the motion at hand, all right? So let's talk about the first one. Alright, this house would give amnesty to all illegal immigrants. Does someone want to jump up and try and give me a definition of that? I told you the questions are going to get harder. It's to be you guys. Have a minute to think about it because it's quite difficult. I'll read out the motion again. This house would give amnesty to all illegal immigrants. In fact, you feel free to have half a minute of the discussion between you and your friends. people think? See, because you're all talking Korean, I can't understand whether you're talking about your answer or whether you're talking about this motion. I'm going to hope that you're all talking about this motion because it's difficult. Alright, does someone want to try and give me a definition for it? Do the kinds of things we were talking about in terms of breaking down what you would expect within the spirit of the motion. Is there a context? What jumps out at you?
Fair to set it during, set a period like during war, how to apply to all.
Would it be fair to set it in times of war? No. It probably deserves to be more of an explanation on that. I think one of the things that you need to be able to explain is why you're linking it to that specific time period. Illegal immigrants don't just exist in periods of war. So it's very hard to say that the problem comes from when we just have refugees at wartime. Because quite frankly, illegal immigrants happen all the time. So if an opposition team says, what do you think happens to them the rest of the time? Because the circumstances for when someone might choose to flee their country could be similar in wartime as it could be in peaceful times, like persecution from the government. Then there's really no distinction between the two, and your affirmative team case will suffer as a result, because they will be able to say that the reasons why someone's an illegal immigrant isn't so much important as to what you do with them once they're in your country, and they're going to exist in non-wartime as well. Yeah. This house would give amnesty to all illegal immigrants.
Well, I'm not really sure that can be a place there or not. That when we think about the relationship between South Korea and North Korea, there are so many immigrants from North Korea these days, and it's also like South Korea, whether drugs in North Korea, because actually in the law of South Korea, it's illegal to meet North Korean people. But still, it's a very controversial issue in South Korea.
Okay.
So, in that case, if we narrow it down to the South Korean North Korean relationship, that can be a place that will unusual. So.
Okay. Firstly, how would you guys... I agree with you. Let me come back to the example about South Korea. Firstly, let me just get this bit clear. How would you guys define amnesty? How would you define the word amnesty? People have gone to illegal immigration. How would you guys define the word amnesty?
I'd like to answer that.
Sorry?
Can I answer that?
I would love it if someone else did, but I will come back to you if no one else does. Actually, I'm not going to come back to you if no one else does. I'm going to wait until somebody else answers. How would you guys define amnesty? Within a debate, I don't mean in conversation, but I mean within a debate. I'm sorry, I have heard from you before, so I'm just going to wait until someone else answers. And I'm soon going to be picking people on the basis of colours of what you're wearing. So if you're in bright clothing, you are seriously in trouble. Luckily, most of you guys are wearing black. Right, how would you define amnesty in this kind of motion? I'm not moving on until we get any kind of definition. You guys have been given this topic in the ADI. Round 1, this house would give amnesty to all illegal immigrants. It's not that far-fetched that you will get a motion like this. I don't have any idea what the motions are. But it is within the realms of possibility that this motion is very, very topical. How would you define amnesty? A very quick definition. There's probably other things you can do with amnesty, but what would you say? Alright, when someone is illegal, what might you want to do to them? when you give them amnesty? Not punish them? So what might you do to someone who is an illegal?
Make them legal.
Yeah. Yeah. Alright, so the motion said it itself, right? What do you want to do to fix the problem with illegal immigrants? I'm not talking about a model, I'm talking about a definition. Remember, my lecture topic is a definition, right? So we'll talk about models and stuff as we progress, but I want to make sure you guys know the basics of how to interpret definitions as well. It's really important that amnesty, when you define it, yes, you might want to say there has to be a process that they're going through, but what you might want to say is we think that they should that we should set up a process which turns them from illegal immigrants to granting full citizenship. Okay? That's what we mean by amnesty. Or something along those lines, I don't care. But something which turns them from illegal to legal. It doesn't have to be that precise to English. Alright? Alright. Now, having said that, illegal immigrants and the motion as a whole, how would you guys define that? If someone was to just chuck this motion out at you, and in fact say that, the lovely lady in the purple scarf, do you want to stand up and give me a definition for this? But how you would define this topic? What would you say?
People who have come illegally into a particular country for political and economical situations of their own.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Is there any qualifiers that you want to put on there? Are there any qualifiers that you'd want to put on that in that definition? Okay, I'll change that around. Do you think you could win a motion if you defined it as anyone who switches to another country due to personal reasons, whether it be economic, political, social, because they like your culture more? As soon as they come to your country, you should have to grant them a process of becoming a legal citizen. No. So would you want to put any qualifiers on there? Yeah? Okay, cool. I've made you stand up for long enough, sorry. Alright, take a seat. Alright, yeah. You probably, what I'm getting at is probably what's up on the board, right? It gives you a clue. There are times when a place set is legitimate. Do you think that this could be one of those times? No? You still don't, even though I'm leading you to the answer? Alright, fine. Since you guys do not think that this would be one of the times that a place set is legitimate, how would you win that case with the definition that the lovely lady has put up? How would you guys win that motion that any time someone comes into your country illegally, you should give them a process of citizenship? How would you win that? Does anybody think that that's winnable? The burden's too big. Yeah, the burden is massive, guys. It means anyone who flies into your country can somehow be granted a process of citizenship. You're ruining the refugee quotas. You're ruining your ability to control your borders. You're ruining your ability to award health services and things to your actual citizen rather than every population member of the whole wide world. How are you guys going to win that motion? Look, it's very easy to say that these kinds of things, when you're talking about these kinds of issues, one of the things that should spring out at you is if you're setting it so wide that it almost, not in every time, but it almost becomes unwinnable because of the wealth of sort of realistic arguments against you, it may be a time when you're allowed to narrow it down. This motion is probably one of those times when you're allowed to narrow it down. Okay? Because you've looked at it and gone, if I run this debate straight up, there is pretty much no way I can win it. In that situation, it should be quite a high test, but in that situation, you are probably allowed to narrow it down. You can narrow it down in many ways. One of the most obvious ways is what?
providing criteria of what kind of interventions.
Nice. Okay, cool. And what else?
Talk about the specific country.
Yeah. Yeah. Talk about the specific country. Anybody want to throw out a country at me where they think it would be legitimate to place it? The US. Yeah. Right. Why? Yeah. It's a huge issue. When I say, should the opposition team be expected to know about this issue, I would say every single person in a competitive debating environment should be expected to know about the issue of illegal immigrants within the US. Alright? So it's fair to set it to that country. What do people think about the South Korea example raised before by, is it Huey? What do people think about that? Is it fair to set it to South Korea? No. If it was a Korean tournament, what about in this tournament? Yeah? Okay. I'm actually on the fence about it, which is why I came back to it. I actually think that most people should know about the problems between North Korea and South Korea and the immigrants that try and flee from North Korea. Right? I think that it's a big enough international issue, but be really careful. Other adjudicators may not agree with you. So you might want to play it safe and set it to a country like the US where all of the adjudicators will agree with you. But in other situations, I really do believe the situation between North Korea and South Korea, when it's not a domestic issue, because it's not exactly, like when you're defining it to internal South Korean politics, that's a little bit different. But when you're setting it to an international issue, which most people in the media should know about, like this issue, I think it's fair enough to place that to South Korea. Alright.
Question?
Yeah.
I'm sure it's a great issue and an important issue, but would it be fair just to call North Koreans immigrants and not refugees?
I think that is how you would define it. And it is really dependent on how you define it. If the opposition team comes up and says, constitutionally, North Korea and South Korea are one country, so they would not be illegal immigrants in their own country, they would just be locationally changing their location within one country. That's a bit of a weird op, but I suppose it's an opposition argument that you can run. I think it's fair enough to say that they would be illegal immigrants because the country that they're trying to flee from doesn't recognise their ability to flee from that country. Like North Korea wants their citizens to be kept under the control of North Korea. So I think it's probably fair to define it as illegal immigrants rather than just refugees. Alright. Okay, does anybody have any questions about this? Because I know it's one of the things that confuses a lot of people as to when to set it to a particular country or when to set it to a particular host of countries. Yeah.
I just have this one motion that I've had since high school and I couldn't find a way to define. It's this house would not sell culture for money.
Mm-hmm.
How the hell are you supposed to define that?
Mm-hmm.
Like, where do I limit it to?
Okay, I am going to come back to that very motion when I go on to my next section, so remind me of it. Okay, great. Alright, so, any other questions? No? Oh, you guys are going to be definitional experts. Alright, let's move on. What are the three types of motions? There are three types of motions. They're called a fact debate, a policy debate, and a value debate. Alright? Apparently there are three. Apparently we should know this three. And then I want you to pretty much disregard the three. But I'm going to teach you the three anyway. I'm going to also teach you why I want you to essentially disregard them. But it's useful to know. Alright. A fact debate. A fact debate is a statement that you are trying to either prove or disprove. Alright? So, that the United Nations is a failure. They're trying to state that as a fact. you are trying to prove that particular fact, right? There might be various ways to prove that particular fact. Usually in a fact debate, examples become extremely important to prove a statement. Yes, you need analysis. You need analysis in every single debate, and it's the most important part of debating. But in fact debates, you really need examples to back it up. Alright? A policy debate. This tends to be, in competitive debating environments, the most common type of debate. Nowadays, earlier on, we used to debate both value debates a lot, like purely value debates. We still do it, but a little less frequently in competitive debating environments. I'm going to explain why in a minute. Policy debates, very, very simple. Pretty much in all policy debates, you will be advocating for a particular action, right? So in most policy debates, you'll be trying to change the status quo. In some policy debates, you might be advocating the status quo. In policy debates, something like this House would nationalise all banks, you're trying to say that the government should take a particular set of actions, or that you yourself would take this particular set of actions. All right. The third one is a value or a judgment debate. Depends on which country you come from as to which one you use. Value debates tend to have terms in it which are value-laden, which sounds a bit weird, but things like freedom, justice, civil liberties, those kinds of things should pop out at you as things that are very, very value-laden and which can be tossed back and forth depending on which value you're trying to advocate and which value is stronger for you to advocate. Alright, I'm going to give you guys an example. Well, there is an example up on the board, but going back to the argument, this House believes that the war in Iraq is never justified. Oh no, how about this? This House believes that the war on terror was never justified, or is never justified, or is unjustifiable, whichever one you want. Alright, to run that as a purely value debate, you try to say whether or not something was good or bad, essentially, right? To run that, to change that into a policy debate, you would say the policy that the US took to actively name certain countries as part of the axis of evil was the wrong policy to take to try and solve the problem of terrorism. Right? That's a policy debate. Whether the US should have taken a set of actions, whether you want them to take a set of actions or not. And the other one, this one, pretty much evaluates that set of actions. It's trying to say whether or not something is, again, good or bad, or it's evaluating a set of values. Right? So often you'll get them in terms of freedom versus freedom and civil liberties versus national security, because there's obviously values that you can advocate on both sides as to which one you want to present within a debate. Alright. It's really, having said that it's not important to learn the distinctions why, I'm going to tell you one reason why it is important. You will get very few debates set as purely a fact debate, okay? Because they don't tend to generate the kind of argumentation that we would want to see. Policy and value judgment. The reason why I don't like, and this is a personal thing, but you'll find this amongst many debaters, I don't like the idea that there are discrete data within a definition, as in you can allocate it to one particular category, like a value debate or a policy debate, is because when you're running a policy debate, does anybody think that you can run a policy debate without actually advocating whether something is good or bad? No, it's really hard to do. And it's also really hard to not put in values within your policy. How does one get up in Parliament, like a politician, justify one of their policies? They're not just going to do technical speak, are they? they're going to appeal to particular values that you might hold, to particular values that voters might hold. So that's why in policy debates, it is almost impossible not to also have some kind of judgment in there. You are judging this policy as to whether or not you would do it. So you do talk about values. A value judgment debate, however, can be run as simply a value judgment debate or not. Do we think this was the morally right thing to do? Do we think that this was the morally wrong thing to do? Which values do we put first? Why do we put these values above other values? Why would we put national security above civil liberties? And we're going to have a philosophical discussion about why national security should always come before civil liberties, right? That would be a value debate. You can run that pure and simple. Most of the time, though, you probably aren't going to. Most of the time, even in these wide set of criteria, like national security being placed above civil liberties, you might want to talk about some of the ways in which that has been done, right? So you might want to talk about some of the policies that have been enacted in defense of national security over civil liberties. One of the things that might jump out at you is something like the Patriot Act. Another thing that might jump out at you is something like wiretapping or things like that, which people say took away from individual liberties, but apparently it backed up national security. So those are the kinds of policies that you might discuss even within a judgment debate. Right? So that's why the two fields are very closely linked, and usually a debate will be all three, usually, or some formation of all three. But it's useful to know. And this is the only thing that I can think of as to why it's useful to know. But you know, don't think that this is the only reason why it's done. I think it's perhaps more useful for beginner debaters, which I don't think you guys necessarily are. But the first thing that I would say is that if you can identify something as a policy debate, usually it will need a model. That's about the best reason I can get for identifying when it's a policy debate. Usually you'll need to say how you want to achieve what you want to achieve in a policy debate. Okay? In a judgment debate, you're not necessarily trying to achieve anything. You're just trying to evaluate something, right? You're trying to put two things against each other. So in a judgment debate, the one thing that you can do, if you've identified that something is a judgment debate, is what? What did we talk about earlier? That the war in Iraq is unjustified. I'm going to define unjustified. But one of the ways I'm going to evaluate whether something is unjustified is whether or not it's illegal, whether or not it saves lives. What am I doing there? Sorry? Yes, brilliant. Did everyone hear that? Yeah. In a value debate, it is probably much more likely that you're going to need to set criteria. Okay? Because national security versus individual liberty. If I just keep repeating that national security is more important, is anybody going to believe me? No. So I need to set up some sort of criteria to evaluate why national security is better than civil liberties. So your criteria may be something like whether or not safety is needed first before you can achieve individual liberties. Okay? So you need to judge whether or not you actually do need to protect your citizens before you can actually afford them individual rights or individual civil liberties. You also might want to judge in a criteria whether group rights should come before individual rights, and why? Because maybe group rights afford the maximum amount of rights to the most amount of people. Whereas individual liberties, it really depends on your position within your society as to whether or not you can actually take advantage of particular individual rights. That kind of thing. So in a value debate, criteria become not just important, but essential. So that's something that's one of the reasons why it's taught in the way it does. But yeah, remember my little last point, a debate will usually fall into both. In a model debate, please don't leave out criteria. You still often do need criteria, but yeah, that's just something to think about. Okay, and that's what I was going to do. And we only have one more thing to go through. But before I do, Dohi's primary school letdown. Because unfortunately, if we don't discuss it, we might still, for the next 10 years, be thinking about that. So the motion was, this house
Would not sell culture for money.
This house would not sell culture for money. Do you guys think my categories were helpful in deciding what that motion is? This house would not sell culture for money. Funnily enough, after rallying against those three categories, I actually think it's pretty helpful in that particular debate. And I'm going to tell you why. In this particular case, it's funny because it doesn't actually, like normal debates about culture do, fall into a judgment debate. This one is actually actively saying you would not do a particular set of actions for a reason, for a particular reason. So it's identifying the reason why you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do it for money. But actually, this is almost a policy debate because it's actually telling you what they want you to do within the motion. It's not, and so you're trying to advocate a particular idea as to what you want to do. So this house would not sell culture for money. The ways that you could interpret that. Interesting motion. All right, so one of the ways that you could say that is nowadays often religious artifacts and artifacts which are really, really precious to a particular country's history or whatever has become extremely valuable, and they sell it to overseas museums, or they sell it to individual art collections or things like that. What you might want to say in that particular circumstance is say, we think certain categories of artifacts, whatever else, should not belong to any particular government of a country. It does not have ownership rights over it in terms of the ability to on-sell it. We think that the only way ownership exists is their ability to protect that particular artifact within the country itself. That's all ownership it has, that's all the ownership rights it has. But these particular cultural artifacts are so important to the country that no one particular government has the right to sell these particular items. So that might be one way that you want to run it. Yeah.
Yeah, in that motion, what if the opposition has prepared it as a policy debate, or what if the government comes up with it as a value debate, saying that they're caring more about value rather than how they're not going to sell culture for money.
Right. So the kinds of things that they might want to say is that they think that the commodification of culture is wrong. The way that what can we do? Okay, the way that we now sell little laughing Buddhas is a bit weird, and the way that how else have we commodified our culture? Gosh, in so many ways, and then none are springing out to me, but you guys know what I mean, right? So there are things that usually have some kind of religious or symbolic pull within the country, and we've commodified it in a way in order to sell it. So if they purely set it up like that we should not, am I allowed to use the term bastardize? Yeah, okay. I'm allowed to use that term. We should not bastardize our culture in a way that because we've embraced everything else in capitalism, apparently we need to do this too. Something like that, I think it's fair enough. I think as the opposition team, you probably don't want to sit up there and go, you should have advocated a particular policy. I think you can still debate on that as to what are the good elements of doing that. For example, you spread your culture. You make more people aware of what your cultural elements are. It's much worse to be enclosed, that kind of stuff. So you can still run that together. All right, last thing. can I set parameters within a debate? Alright. Reasonable restrictions are often going to be allowed within a particular definition. Okay? And I don't just mean the restrictions of which country you can set it to. But if you're ever going to set parameters, you need to be very clear on why you're setting those parameters. Usually, it's actually for a very simple reason. You're trying to make the debate a lot clearer. That's honestly, most of the time, the reason that you're going to set parameters. It's not even to try and win. It's to try and have two identifiable positions within a debate that are very clear, and to do that. Obviously, you're often trying to also set parameters to try and win and to not give yourself an unreasonable risk. So let's talk about ones that we might want to set parameters on. What are some of the very obvious parameters? They're kind of up there, so it's easy to...
Place setting?
Yeah, I mean definitely putting it in one country. Yeah. And what's one of the most obvious ways in which we group countries? Yeah, I mean that's one of the most obvious parameters that we often set our debates to, whether we're going to choose to set it in the developing world or the developed world. But there are heaps of other parameters that we often just normally do within debates. I'm going to get you guys to do one for me. This house would allow gay couples to adopt. Right. Someone want to yell out the restriction that they would place on that motion. This house would allow gay couples to adopt. Where might you want to set this motion to? Do you think it's reasonable? Sorry? Yeah, kind of.
Where civil unions are involved.
Where civil unions are allowed?
Can you set
Okay.
place like countries where gay couples are allowed to marry each other?
Yeah.
Or is it too narrowly defined?
No. But can you go broader? Okay. Okay. On that, so you're saying civil unions need to exist for gay couples to adopt, right? Do that?
So that's already a parameter, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair parameter. But is there a broader parameter that you can set it to without having to say that civil unions have to exist? Or do couples mean civil unions?
If we were to make it a bit broader, I mean, it would be really hard on ourselves as well, to prove, to argue that gay people, I mean, for all we know, they could be changing partners all the time. And what kind of a stable household would that be for the child?
All right. I think that it would probably be fair enough to say in countries which allow civil unions. I personally think that the only boundary that should be put is countries which allow homosexuality to exist in the first place. I think that's a much better boundary. I don't think you need to be married to necessarily be allowed to adopt. I think it makes it harder in the adoption process, just as single mothers who want to adopt are put further down the line. But I think that should be the same with gay people. Like if they are single and gay, that may be down the line. But that gay couples, in terms of homosexuality allowed to exist within that country, should be the one criteria that you might want to look at. And there's just one more I'm going to run through with you guys. This house would allow the use of child labour. This house would allow the use of child labour. What parameters would you want to set for that? Sorry? Okay, interesting. So you're saying child labour, but certain employment standards should be in place, so health and safety regulations or something. Interesting. Children's rights. You want to run children's rights in a debate about child labour? Sorry, say that again. Labour's rights and the children's rights. Hold on, so... Oh, okay. So in the motion, this House would allow the use of child labour. The restriction that you would want to put on it was... Oh, in countries that do have rights for children. Okay. Do people think that's fair? In a debate about child labour, do you think that the issue that the adjudicators were setting was whether or not New Zealand 16-year-olds are allowed to go on their paper rights? Do you think that that's the issue that they were trying to get at? No, probably not. Yeah. Any other kinds of parameters that you might look? Oh, this is a difficult one. Any other kinds of parameters that you might want to set on it?
We're guaranteed minimum wage.
Okay. So yours is quite similar to ours. You would want child labour to only exist in countries which guaranteed rights for the child, protection, minimum standards of wage and health and safety and that kind of stuff. Okay, we're coming back to that.
Would it be wrong if you kind of change the topic of the nation? For example, this House will allow the use of child labor. You define the House as a developed nation, and you define the child labor as bright, young, intelligent ones who can work, but are underage.
Right. So
then in that
you would want to then be arguing for. In developed nations, we're going to say mandatory education is wrong. They're allowed to choose to work if they want to. So you think that that's the motion that people would be getting at in a motion about child labour?
No.
No. So my whole lecture about when you're allowed to narrow it down is that. Or when, it would probably be considered a squirrel. Yeah. Developing countries, yay! That's one of the parameters that I like. Yeah, because you guys, you're trying to run away from the issue with the ways that you guys are setting it in. Like, setting this topic about child labour in countries where child labour doesn't exist or where it's not a problem is running away from the issue. What did I tell you guys about that? We don't want to do that. We like arguments. We like debating the controversial issues. And you can justify it. You can say child labour is a necessary evil and we don't like it, but in developing nations, it's crucial that we have it because otherwise these people die. Whereas in developed nations, we don't need it. Right? In developed nations, you don't actually need to allow for child labour. Whereas in developing, you do. That's why you set that parameter and you can justify your parameter. What's any kind of other parameter that you might want to throw out there? Yeah?
Like perhaps limiting the time they actually work so it doesn't interfere with the mandatory education.
Okay, again, we're coming back to that you would want to set particular standards. I think that you can say that the same standards that apply to adults, that you'd probably, within those countries, that you'd probably afford to the children. But what's the problem with saying that people should be allowed minimum wage? People should have pristine sewing environments instead of, the 12 hours a day that they do work. Well, why do children get hired in the first place? If you set all those conditions, these children will be out of jobs because most of these places will not be able to afford to give the minimum wage. They'll employ far fewer people. And then as an affirmative, your arguments go down the drain, don't they, about these people dying if they don't get jobs. Right? So it may be easier to just say, yeah, minimum standards if we can try and get them. But what we think is more important is the ability to feed yourself, grow up and be a middle class, have some money, and then long term we think this is much better for the country's development progress. Right, the only other restriction that you may want to chuck in there are probably others, is maybe just restricting it to legal professions, right? So you don't want to say children should have to be in porn stars, or, you know, things committed against them that are illegal acts or that kind of stuff. Yeah, last question.
Can you set out the perimeter as, for child labor, can you set out the perimeter as those who are willing to do it? I mean, there are some child who are doing it mandatorily, so.
Yeah. I mean, you want to distinguish between slave labor and child labor. Yeah. If you want to chuck that in there, that's fine. Yeah. All right, guys. Are there any other questions about this lecture overall? Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, where homosexuality is legal. For example, in Iran, it's illegal to be gay. Apparently there is no such thing as being gay, right? It's really hard to allow adoption in a country like that. Any other questions? Alright, when you guys do get this sheet of paper, it actually has another page, Jodie, you just want to hit down for a second, where it's got technical stuff in there, which you might want to have a look through before, and we'll get it out to you hopefully before the tournament starts. It's just a few off-the-cuff kinds of things. So just have a quick scroll through when we hand that out. But thank you very much for